So from 1815 and the final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo until the outbreak of World War I, there is not going to be a major continental worldwide globe-spanning war. Remember, we talked about the 7 Years' War, which was fought in India and fought in the Caribbean and fought in the Pacific and fought in Europe and fought in the North American continent. It involved many powers. It lasted for many years. None of that is going to happen. There is going to be an incredible focus among the powers to coordinate their activities and to try very hard not to step on each other's toes, to mind each other's spheres of influence. And if you have to defeat a power, like the French who are defeated here, we're going to see that the powers who defeat Napoleon treat France itself very generously. Very generously. The occupation is very brief. The indemnity, originally there wasn't even going to be an indemnity in 1814, but then when Napoleon returns and the French rally to his side, they're like, okay, we're going to hit you with an indemnity here, a large cash payment. But basically, very quickly, within a couple of years, France is welcomed back into the concert of powers. The other powers see a strong France as a stabilizing force within this great power system that they're creating at this time. It only breaks down one time, and this is when incompatible interests, just kind of things boil over. There's going to be an increasing focus on what we call the Eastern question. The Eastern question. This is going to be something that I talk about more and more and more and more as the semester goes on, because it is this Eastern question. What to do about the disintegrating power of the Ottoman Empire in southeastern Europe that is going to provide the proximate cause for the explosion of World War I. So the Eastern question is starting at this time. Because what's happening here is the British don't want the Russians to control the Straits of Constantinople. Because the British don't want the Russians in the Mediterranean Sea. They want them bottled up in the Black Sea, where they can't threaten British interests in the Mediterranean. The Crimean War, which happens in the 1850s, and that's it. That's the only war when the European powers rumble, and it's going to be Russia on one side, and it's going to be Britain and France and the Ottomans on the other. And the British and the French are just trying to prop up the Ottomans. They don't actually have any interest in taking territory from the Ottomans. They just don't want the Russians moving in. All the other wars and conflicts are going to involve no more than two powers, and they're all going to be involving the question of nationalism. So, let's get started here, because that's where we're going. I'm going to read you a rather lengthy passage, but one that's very, very instructive, and it's not one that I had required you to read. I'll be honest with you, I would recommend reading all of these chapters and all the chapters of these subsequent books. You have no obligation to do so, of course, but especially if you're interested in history, they're really just excellent texts. And he talks about developments. He talks about developments in the arts, in science, and religion. He has chapters devoted to all of these, and he carries them through each book. So here, he has chapter 14, the arts, and its developments in art from 1789 to 1848. And then in the next book, The Age of Capital, he has another chapter, the arts, and he's talking about developments in art during this period. He has chapters about the status of women. So there's all sorts of really great stuff in these books. But let's get to it. So let's dispense with one thing first. One of the big consequences of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars is British naval maritime supremacy. By 1814, well, we'll just stick with 1815. By 1815, the British Navy has more ships than all the other navies of the world combined. So British Navy dominates global trade. For those of you who are into military history, is there anyone in here who's a military history buff? Thinking about maybe writing about military history?
I'm writing about military history.
Right.
It's kind of a learning.
Yes. Okay, well, the key battles here, very interesting, the key battles here were actually against French allies. Against French allies. Because remember, as the revolutionary armies and Napoleon are going and conquering these other territories, they're interested in getting their troops and their resources, including their naval resources. So some of the biggest battles that the British are going to win are actually against, like, the Spanish fleet, who are allied to the French, or the Dutch fleet, which is allied to the French. Yes, there are instances where the British do defeat French fleets, like at Trafalgar, and in the Battle of the Nile. This is a really fun one. Napoleon at one point decides that he's going to conquer Egypt, and Nelson is like shadowing his fleet, and Napoleon, when he gets off the boat, like the last thing he says is like, hey, don't get penned in here, okay? Just go sail around. Don't let the British surprise you here in the harbor and destroy you. And like as soon as he's gone, the dude drops anchor in the harbor and gets obliterated by the British, which causes Napoleon all kinds of problems. I don't really talk much about the Egyptian campaign. It's a horrible failure. It's like the least successful military campaign of Napoleon's career, even including Russia. At least in Russia, he wins the battles. He just can't get the Tsar to come to terms. He doesn't even know how to do war properly. I defeated you. Why aren't you surrendering?
How would he get back?
How was he going to get back? He was supposed to get back on the fleet, right? They were supposed to land the fleet, crush the Ottoman forces, seize all the important territories on it, and jump back on the boats. Well, the British fleet destroys his fleet, and so Napoleon basically has to get smuggled back on like a single ship. He basically abandons his army in Egypt. It's actually kind of a critical turning point, though, in the revolution, because Napoleon at this point, I will come back to the naval stuff in just a sec. So Napoleon, well, let me come back to this. Okay, I'll make a note to myself. Egyptian campaign. So, the other key battles, Cape St. Vincent destroys the Spanish fleet. This is the one that makes then Captain, he's not an admiral, but Captain Nelson famous. Have you ever heard the expression turn the blind eye? If you turn the blind eye to something? Okay, well, ships back then, you didn't have like radios. And so what you had were flagmen, right? Who would signal like different, they would have flags. Like you'd literally be like, hey, tell the fleet that we're going to, like veer right and then we're going to try and, encircle around them. And so there'd be like the flagship, that would be like the main capital ship that would signal the rest of the ships. Well, basically, the situation was looking a little dicey. The British were very outnumbered. They're always outnumbered. And the admiral is like, signal the guys that we're going to pull back. And Captain Nelson, who's commanding one of the capital ships, it was actually SS Captain. He basically is like, he puts his telescope up. He had a blind eye. He had an eye that didn't work. So he put the telescope up to the eye that didn't work. And they were like, Captain, I think they're telling us to pull back. And he's like, I don't see it. I don't see it. Full sail ahead. And he winds up winning an incredible victory, and it kind of makes him famous there. That's where that expression, turn the blind eye, comes from. And then they defeat the Dutch fleet at Camperdown. So these are two incredibly important French naval victories. Because they defeat the French fleet, then they defeat the Spanish fleet, then they defeat the Dutch fleet. Whose fleet is left? No one's. No one's fleet is left. So now Great Britain goes around the world and just starts collecting all the other colonies. They take the Dutch colonies. That's where South Africa, that's when South Africa, that critical way station on the way to India, that's when the British take that. The Indonesian possessions, the French Caribbean possessions, all the different strategic posts like Gibraltar and Malta, and all, this is when the British collect all these to themselves. Now at the end of the war, they wind up giving some of them back because the British kind of realize, we don't really need to hold all these. They're kind of expensive to maintain. We're just going to keep the really critical ones that are important to our naval and commercial empire. But that's one of the big results of the French Revolution is total British naval domination of the globe. And this is going to last really until World War I. The decade right before World War I, the decade and a half, sees the Germans and the Americans start building fleets to the point where the British are, They're still the biggest fleet. They're still the biggest, they're still the most powerful, but now it's starting to look like, what did Churchill say about Jellicoe? Churchill said that Admiral Jellicoe was the only man who could lose the war in an afternoon. Meaning that, like, at this point, the German fleet is so powerful that a battle with them by Admiral Jellicoe, if it doesn't go quite right, could lose Britain the war. So that's how powerful the British competitors are getting. But for the next, basically 100 years, really until like 1900, total domination. The British go where they want and do what they want. So, the key Napoleonic battles. So, yes, the Egyptian campaign. So as you will recall from last week and then Monday, Napoleon has incredible amounts of success. He wins the Italian campaigns in 1797. This forces Austria to come to terms. This takes all that territory from them. It makes Napoleon the most famous general of the French revolutionary leaders. He uses this political capital to say to the Directory government, hey, we should take Egypt. We should take Egypt. And then go around all the way up the straits there. And so he does this. Campaign's a total disaster. And while he's gone, the war starts back up. Well, the war had kind of gone down because Austria dropped out. But the other French revolutionary generals start losing battles. And Napoleon hears that, oh my gosh, the Allied armies, the coalition armies are pushing into France again. And so he smuggles his way back across in 1799, wins several decisive battles, drives them back out of France, and then is when he does his coup. He basically decides, look, everyone is pretty much hopeless at this except for me, so I'm just going to be in charge now. And so this is when the Brumaire coup happens. So 1799 is when Brumaire happens. And we all know that very quickly he becomes, initially he's first consul, then he's first consul for life, and then he's emperor. And that all happens in between the years 1799 and 1804, if you'll remember from Monday. So, immediately, he starts going on a tear. The key battles. 1805, I'll write these up here in case you want them for reference. In 1805, he smashes the Austrians at Austerlitz. Smashes the Austrians at Austerlitz. Then the Prussians, it's the Prussians' turn. 1806, the Prussians get smashed at Jena. Oh, sorry. I'll write Prussians. Prussians. At Jena and at Auerstadt. Also at Auerstadt were the Russians. The Russians are coming into the war. I think that was another one, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
1806 and 7. Because here's the critical thing about the Russians. Yes, Napoleon defeats the Russians many times in battle. The problem is, the Russian armies are humongous. They can take high levels of losses. Remember, the Austrian and Prussian armies are like these small professional armies that are just getting overrun and smashed by these much larger French armies. So tactics aside, it's just a question of quantity. Well, the Russians, they have quantity. They got plenty of quantity. They have the biggest army. So they're actually going to be able to survive these encounters that I'm about to write up here. They are at Auerstadt. Oh no, you were right. You were right. So the Russians, Auerstadt, fighting alongside the Prussians.
There's another blue one in here.
I might grab that. Eylau. The Russians get very badly mauled there. And they're on their own at that point. And then finally at Friedland. And this causes the Russians to make a long-term peace with Napoleon called the Treaty of Tilsit. This is a major development, the Treaty of Tilsit. And this is a treaty with the Russians. And the Treaty of Tilsit basically draws a dividing line on the European continent. And it says, look, Tsar, you can dominate your own area, you can dominate portions of Poland, Norway, and I, Napoleon, am going to dominate Prussia and Austria and obviously France and Belgium. And so it basically divides it up, right? And it's at this point, two other things are going on. So, first of all, let's see, 1806 and 1808, right? Okay, so in 1806, so right in the midst of this, Napoleon imposes his continental system. Remember, this is him trying to cut the British off from the continent. No more trading with the British. He believes that Britain's economy is so dependent on trade with the continent that he'll be able to force them, he'll be able to put enough economic pressure on Britain to force them to make peace with him. Because he can't invade the British Isles on account of the British Navy being way too strong. They do try some funny abortive stuff, like they encourage the Irish to rise up against the British, and they try to land ships. But the thing about the waters around England, I think I mentioned this during the Spanish Armada section. The waters there are super choppy. There's lots of cross currents. It's very rocky, and we're talking about wooden ships with no lights and stuff, and very crude navigational equipment. So the Irish are put down repeatedly during this period. Poor Ireland. So Napoleon's continental system is introduced at this point. The Treaty of Tilsit, this agreement with the Russians, Napoleon is largely going to wind up throwing this out because after a few years, the Russian economy is really hurting from this. Really hurting. Because Russia and Britain, yes, they're about to become huge rivals after France goes down swinging. They're going to eventually start getting very chippy with each other over the Eastern question and approaches to India. Because if you have your map of Russia in your head, you know that they're expanding down into Central Asia. And what's down here? Oh, it's India. And in the 1830s and 1840s, the British imperial planners start to get super paranoid about the Russians. So we will have occasion to talk about that. But at this point, the British and Russians, they hadn't had any reason for animosity. They had no conflicting geopolitical aims at this point. The Eastern question isn't a thing yet. And in fact, their economies had been very mutually codependent on each other. You have Russia, which is just this large producer of commodities, things like food and grain and raw materials, timber, all this good stuff. And the British economy, which doesn't have that stuff, and which takes these raw inputs and produces finished goods. Britain is the only really industrialized economy at this point. So there was great complementarity between the Russians and the British. Well, just think about it. Now all of a sudden, as a result of the Treaty of Tilsit, Russia is being told, no, you can't trade with Britain. And so the Tsar, after a couple of years, starts allowing this trade to go on. He doesn't make a proclamation that, okay, we're no longer doing that, but are you familiar with regulatory forbearance? It's when there's laws, but the regulators in charge of enforcing them just stop enforcing them. It's like that. So this bustling trade is happening, and Napoleon's like, hey, Tsar, I thought you said, it's yeah, I don't know. I mean, you got the laws, got this stuff, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. I can't figure it out. And it wasn't just the Tsar. Some of Napoleon's own family members who he had put on various thrones were allowing this trade to go on. So just can't rely on anybody. Just can't rely. Speaking of which, in 1808, while this is going on, right away, there's always a fire going on. Napoleon is never able to just sit back and relax. If he's not invading something else is happening. In 1808, the Spanish ulcer erupts. The Spanish revolt against his brother Joseph. I'm going to put the Spanish ulcer because that's what they call it, the Spanish ulcer. It just won't go away. It's just this slow, annoying bleed. It's not life-threatening, but it's taking away resources. There are whole armies in Spain trying to stomp down these guerrillas. But as you know, mountainous, difficult terrain, small local insurgency groups, almost impossible to destroy. Almost impossible to destroy. This is the period, too, when the Spanish possessions revolt. Now, I'm not going to talk about the formation of the Spanish republics until next week. Your reading is about nationalism, and there's a great section there about the Spanish republics. But just for now, remember, those Spanish notables in Latin America had revolted. Had revolted after the Bourbons were deposed and this Napoleonic usurper had taken the throne. Well, they're going to come back into the fold or be pacified by the Spanish government once the war is over. And it won't be until this happens again in the 1820s that you have like Bolivar and O'Higgins and San Martin and who's the other one? They create basically like Argentina and Gran Colombia and Peru, kind of make them into independent states. This is when the Monroe Doctrine, American history guys, right? And gals, yeah. This is when the Monroe Doctrine is articulated. Yes, the revolt and continental system. Okay, so in order to enforce this continental system, Napoleon comes to the drastic conclusion that he must invade Russia, right? What could possibly go wrong? We're just going to invade some Russia. So in 1812, he invades Russia, and he's trying to get them to engage him in a decisive battle. But what happens? You guys remember?
Sure.
Well, yes, winter eventually comes, but what do the Russians do? Do the Russians offer battle? No, they just keep withdrawing, right? They just keep withdrawing and destroying everything. Destroying everything. It's a scorched earth strategy, right? Because I mentioned this in Monday's lecture that I posted. The Napoleonic armies conquered Europe in very short, sudden, rapid bursts. They did not have developed logistics or supply chains or anything like that. They would just lightning campaign into the area. They would just basically go to the local innkeeper and say, we're here to liberate you. We're going to need about 10,000 pounds of fish and, some boots. And they lived off the territory. They lived off the land, lived off the population. It wasn't like there was this complex convoy system coming from France and these other places supplying the armies. Well, this worked in very rich, wealthy, densely concentrated Western and even Central Europe to some degree. In Lombardy, in the Holy Roman Empire. But once you start getting out into the furthest reaches of what was formerly Poland and getting into European Russia, vast empty spaces. Very poor. Not a lot of lootable stuff. There's a lot of empty, vast terrain. Also, not a lot of roads. And the roads there are kind of crappy roads. And there's all these stories of the French marshals like have these maps, and they're like, "There's not even this road isn't even on this map. Where are we?" There's just not adequate maps. And Napoleon thinks, "All right, we're going to force a decisive battle." No, the Tsar's armies just keep retreating, pulling them further and further into Russia, stretching out their supplies, weakening them. They finally offer battle at a place called Borodino, and it's like probably the most horrifying battle of the war, if I'm being honest. Because there's no cute positioning or anything. It's just, okay, they've chosen that they're going to fight right here. We really want to fight them right here. And it's like 500,000 dudes versus 500,000 dudes, like 1 million dudes just killing each other all day long. Like, no cute, feints, it's just like straight into the breach, just horrifying bloodbath. It's technically a win for Napoleon because when night comes, the Russians withdraw. So it's like, yay, we won. Except that the Russians don't surrender. They just keep withdrawing further inland. And Napoleon is just taking some pretty heavy casualties. And he's not prepared to replace these casualties. He's very far from home now at this point. And Moscow's right up ahead. He's thinking, we'll just besiege Moscow, defeat them, force a peace. No, they keep withdrawing beyond Moscow. The Tsar and the army, they leave. Now, they don't set the city on fire on purpose. Everything that I've read suggests that a fire got started at some point and the Tsar's army wasn't interested in putting it out because they were trying to get out of there, and Napoleon's armies were just moving in, and so just kind of a blade. Just imagine like a bunch of wooden houses all tucked together, right? It just goes up into flames. So now Napoleon and his army are sitting in this ruined, burned out city with winter approaching, with no food, and the Tsar is like, I'll never surrender. And so Napoleon has zero good options. So he attempts to do that age-old tradition of rulers, which is declare victory and go home, right? So he declares victory and goes home, but no one is confused about this. This campaign was meant to bring the Russian Empire under his control, and it failed. The Russian Tsar is still like, I'll never surrender, and he sends his army after Napoleon. When Napoleon turns and starts going back, it's not like the Russian army just sits there. They immediately start harassing the French army and attacking them as they're leaving. 600,000 men go into Russia. 100,000 come out. They're being wiped out by battle, by attrition, by disease, by malnutrition, by cold, because now winter has set in. Well, as Napoleon comes staggering out of Russia, he's going this way actually, he's staggering out of Russia, all the people who he had previously defeated and imposed pretty harsh treaties on realize this is our chance. Let's revolt now, all together. So the Prussians and the Austrians and the Russians all come together to battle him in 1813 as Napoleon is retreating in this very famous battle called the Battle of Leipzig, which is more famously and often referred to as the Battle of the Nations. The Battle of the Nations. This is an even bigger battle than Borodino. It's the biggest battle in European history until World War I, and Napoleon loses. He's mostly just overwhelmed. Tactically, there was nothing really that wrong with what he did, but actually, I would say this. Napoleon is getting a little older, not quite as decisive maybe, starting to maybe doubt himself a little bit, because there was a chance for him to attack, I believe it was the Prussian army that got there first, but he hesitated, and then the Prussian and Austrian armies, and then those armies came together. Whereas previously, if you remember, I had said he was very famous for lightning fast Julius Caesar-style campaigns, where if he saw two armies coming to merge together, he would drive right into the center of them, and then send one wing this way and another wing that way, and no. So he's defeated. He abdicates in 1814. 1814, he abdicates. Basically, he wants to keep fighting, but his marshals realize Paris is overrun. Like, literally, the Russian army has marched into Paris. It's over. He abdicates, and he is sent to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. The Bourbons are brought back. It's the brother of Louis XVI, Louis XVII, who's going to be with us. Louis XVII. No, Louis XVIII, I'm sorry. Louis XVII was the son of Louis XVI who tragically died. So Louis XVIII, the Bourbons are going to come back. I'm going to erase this in a second. I'm just going to kill off Napoleon here. 1815, when the Bourbons come back, they have to do a lot of super unpopular stuff, like demobilize the army. That's like, imagine you're all soldiers, right? And the new administration shows up and says, you're all fired. And there's not like some great benefits package, like, no, now you're all just unemployed. So there's like hundreds of thousands of unemployed dudes now. The Bourbon government needs to raise taxes. There's also the reactionary royalists among them, like the Comte d'Artois, future King Charles, who's like, yay, feudalism is back in France. And they're just walking around acting like, aristocratic privilege is going to come back. And so, very unsurprisingly, there's a lot of unrest in France. Word gets back to Napoleon that, your emperorship, if you were to return, everyone would just flock to your banners. The Bourbons are terrible, just as bad as ever. They learned nothing and forgot nothing. So Napoleon lands, he escapes on a little boat, lands in France, and they send armies to stop him because it's just him and a handful of dudes, But he shows that the armies, when they come upon him and his little band, they hail him as Imperator and join his side, and he reinvades France, and it's not until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 that Napoleon is finally defeated, and this time they put him on a boat and they dump him in the furthest reaches of the southern Atlantic Ocean that they can find, St. Helena. He tries to kill himself with arsenic, which probably gives him brain damage because it doesn't work. It doesn't kill him, but it does cause him to have a lot of health problems for the remaining several years of his life. So, always gotta have your good boys. Come on. He's losing a step, you can tell. So he's dead. Bonapartism, though, is going to remain a very popular political ideology, though. Bonapartism. This is the idea of, remember, Rousseau, the idea of the general will. The general will, which inspired the French revolutionaries, said that the nation, the will of the nation, should be what rules it. Now, it can be expressed through democracy or through a dictatorship. That means one person acting on behalf of the people. Napoleon was insanely successful. He was literally the most successful ruler in all of France's history. And after Napoleon's defeat, France is going to drop out of the first rank of powers. They're not going to be in the first rank of powers anymore. They're never going to be as wealthy, as powerful, as respected. And so there's this nostalgia for Bonaparte, for Bonapartism, for a strong, powerful leader who's going to take France back to glory. And his nephew, Louis Napoleon, is eventually going to become the second emperor of France following the revolutions of 1848. So I'm going to write this up here before I erase all this. So when Karl Marx is looking at French history and he's theorizing about the cyclicalness of history, he's got a point here. Because what you had was you had French Republic. I'll say Republic. We're in France. This is all French. You have Republic. Then you have Empire. You had monarchy, Republic, Empire. Then you had monarchy, Republic, Empire. This had been his experience of France. So from like 1789 to 1851, this is France right here. You have monarchy. Monarchy does a bad job ruling. There's a revolution. There's a republic. The republic gets out of control. And so the conservative forces seize upon a general and make him in charge. And in both cases, it's a Napoleon. So Napoleon, little Napoleon. So, yeah. And this empire will last until 71, when Bismarck tricks him into fighting Germany. Because one of the big winners of the French Revolution is actually Prussia. Prussia is a huge winner. Britain is number one winner, no question. Britain is the number one winner of the French Revolution. Woohoo! No, Britain wins. Britain wins. But another huge winner is Prussia. Because I mentioned that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? The sincerest form of flattery. I also mentioned that we are in a period now of state death. If you are a weak state, you may be partitioned and destroyed by your enemies. Or Poland, right? Poland, no more. Well, if you have just been crushed by this new revolutionary army, what do you need to do if you want to stay in the game? Well, you need to make some changes. And Prussia is going to make the most comprehensive changes of any of the powers involved. Russia makes no changes. Russia is never really defeated. Like, yes, they're defeated at Eylau and Friedland, and they signed the Treaty of Tilsit, but like, that's not imposing really anything on Russia. That's just saying, okay, Russia, we won't fight anymore, and you stay over there, and I'll be over here. And we'll be allies. Russia doesn't make any changes. Russia at the start of the war is still an absolutist feudal society, and at the end of the war, it is an absolutist feudal society, and the only serious effort at revolution, the Decembrists. Anyone into like indie music? The Decembrists? Okay, it's like an officer's revolt, and it's easily crushed. But Russia's not really going to be a part of our revolutionary story as we go through the tumultuous 19th century. Russia is going to be kind of that absolutist reactionary power that's standing ready to help reinforce the monarchs who are trying to keep their throne under this series of revolutions. In 1848, we're going to see that the Hungarians revolt against the Austrian Habsburg throne, and it's only by calling in the Russians to put them down that the Austrians are able to keep the empire together. So this is part of what's called the Congress system. The Congress system says, the Congress system, 1815. They are interested, the people who get together in the Congress, this is Vienna, by the way, Congress of Vienna. It's held in Vienna. The interest in the post-Napoleonic settlement is to keep an approximate equilibrium between the 5 great powers. That's Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, and France. Okay? Now I'm going to talk about Prussia here because Prussia's the big winner. As I said, Russia makes really no changes. Russia's the same before and after. Britain doesn't really see any domestic changes either. Britain is really domestically unaffected by the war. It's kind of crazy. Has anyone read like a Jane Austen novel? Persuasion? You know that takes place during the Napoleonic Wars. You'd never know that though, right? They don't even mention it. Imagine a French novel of this time, or a Germanic novel of this time, or a Russian novel of this time being written, and they don't even mention that there's this cataclysmic war going on. But the British homeland is entirely insulated. The war isn't fought there. It's all fought at sea. They don't really field any serious land armies. They do insert some small expeditionary forces on the Iberian Peninsula under the Duke of Wellington, but it affects virtually no one at home. In fact, the war is a huge boon to Britain. Britain is the only industrial power. So they benefit tremendously from this. France, I'll come back to them. So unchanged, pretty much just killing it, but no real domestic reforms. It's not like they're like, oh my gosh, we need to change the way we do things. No, Britain won this war. And at times was the only one fighting Napoleon, and also they paid other allies to fight. So they would help pay the bills of these other allies to stay in the war. France. I'm going to come back to France in just a second, but let me talk about, well, maybe I should talk about France first. Tough. I'm going to talk about Prussia. So number one, the people drawing up this agreement are aristocrats. Okay? This is the sort of the leisure domain of foreign policy, is that it's the aristocrats who conduct foreign policy. And so they tend to think in terms of like, old feudal, monarchical, aristocratic, landed people. They don't really understand things like commerce and industry. Remember, the Industrial Revolution is really only taking place in England and the Low Countries. It isn't until the 1830s, 40s, 50s that really then it zooms off in the continent. So when they are dividing up the spoils, they give Prussia the Rhineland and parts of Saxony. Poor Saxony. Saxony, the king of Saxony, he loved Napoleon because Napoleon wanted to keep the continent isolated from Britain. And Saxony was the most industrially developed part of Germany. And so think about it. If we're keeping out British industrial imports, who's going to benefit? Saxony, right? Because they're the ones who now can produce and sell more stuff without that pesky British competition. So the king of Saxony bails on Napoleon too late, so they get punished as part of the settlement. So large parts of Saxony go to Prussia, and the Rhineland goes to Prussia. This is a highly industrialized area. This is the part of Germany that France insists on occupying after World War I. So this is when Prussia gets these huge industrial resources. Previously, Prussia's power had been that it was like a highly professional, militarized state. They didn't have like a lot of raw resources. This right here is when Prussia becomes not just militarily dominant, but also eventually economically dominant. basically the settlement, and this was not the intention of the makers of the Congress system. They didn't intend to empower Prussia and make it into Super Prussia, which is eventually going to unify all of Germany, which is what's going to happen. But they can only do that because of this settlement. Prussia, though, isn't just sitting on its hands. After they get humiliated, after the monarchy gets humiliated at Jena and Auerstedt, they go crazy. They abolish serfdom. Now all of a sudden, you can move, you can work where you want, you can own land, you don't owe feudal dues. They create a meritocratic army and civil service. Previously, it had literally been, okay, aristocrats run things, you get to be the head of the Ministry of Finance because you're my son and I'm related to him. And no, they look at France and they're like, gosh, it seems like a lot of these commoners, these people are like really talented. Maybe the fact that they aren't like blue-blooded nobles shouldn't disqualify them from holding public office. And there's a chapter in this book actually called, I believe it's called The Career Open to Talent. Yeah, 182, The Career Open to Talent. Where all of a sudden, it's not about God's chosen man in the blood of my ancestors and stuff. It's like, hey, are you good at balancing the books? Hey, can you win battles? Okay, you're in charge of the money, you're in charge of the war. Think about it, France just steamrolled you. Just a bunch of peasants, they just crushed you. So a meritocratic civil service and army, universal conscription. Conscription, draft, right? Remember, when France was in trouble in 1893 and the Jacobins needed to raise that massive army, the levée en masse, universal conscription. Every male is to be subject to the service of the state. And I talked about how this kind of horrified other leaders, like, oh my God, they're arming the peasants. This is the last thing you want to do. Most of the time, your army is used to put down your unruly peasants. Well, now they decide, well, if we're not going to be completely destroyed by France, we need to take the chance and start conscripting our own peasants into the army to make large conscript armies. And so the Germans do that. The Prussians, I shouldn't say the Germans. They are all Germans, like Saxons, Bavarians, Prussians, right? They're all Germans, but at this point, they're still kind of separate. Universal conscription, universal education, setting up public school systems. Because they realized, wow, to have more like administrators to run these complicated tax structures and to staff the armies and the navies and stuff, there's just not enough aristocrats. And to run industrial factories and stuff like that, you need more educated people. People who are numerate and literate. Again, this is something that we kind of take for granted, but like numeracy wasn't something that was of high concern in peasant societies, nor was literacy really. Especially if you weren't living in a Protestant state. I don't know. Well, maybe I'll talk about that later. Protestantism was just a huge boon to literacy because you had to read the Bible, right? In Catholic countries, literacy rates were far lower for far longer because there was no emphasis on you personally reading the Bible. As long as you went to Mass on Sunday and listened to what the priest had to say, you were done. So if you track literacy rates in Europe, you'll see a very wide divergence between Catholic countries and Protestant countries. Protestant countries were way more literate, and they also wound up being way more industrialized. And there's probably a connection there. There's a very famous book to that effect, Protestantism and Capitalism by Max Weber. The Protestant ethic is what it's called, the Protestant ethic in capitalism.
That's in my paper.
Yes, it was a very influential book, and I'm not saying you can't critique that theory, of course, but like it's pretty decent. It's pretty sound thesis. He was also a super uber German nationalist too. He was pretty gung ho about the Reich, the Second Reich, to be clear, the Second Reich. So the First Reich was Charlemagne's Reich, and then we're going to make the Second Reich here in a few weeks, and then Hitler's is the Third Reich. Trade liberalization. The Prussians also do this. Remember, this had been a military autocracy with serfdom. Now all of a sudden, you've got universal conscription, universal education, and trade liberalization. Meaning the state is relaxing all of these controls, standardizing all the taxes and regulations, weights, measures. This is all done, of course, to increase Berlin's state power. And it does. It does. This sets Prussia on the road to being the most powerful state in continental Europe. in 1815, I would say probably of the continental powers, so forget Britain. Russia is number 1. France is probably number 2. Prussia and Austria. Prussia would probably be Austria in a straight up fight, but they're like a distant third. 50 years later, they're number 1. So these transformations that are undergone as a result of the French Revolution and the Congress settlement are going to have huge, huge impacts on European history. Because we all know this new unified German state was very peace-loving and caused 0 problems for the rest of history. So, you know. And if you believe that the world we live in now is a product of the Cold War, and that the Cold War was a product of World War II, and that World War II was a product of World War I, and that World War I was a product of the long 19th century, of which this is a critical moment, and we can see why this is important. So, Austria tries to do these things, but poor Austria, they have a problem. This is a problem that we're going to return to a lot. Nationalism, difference. See, in Prussia, everyone speaks a language. Germany, everyone is a religion. Protestant, yeah, they're mostly Catholics, but they're Protestant, right? So you have Protestant Germans who speak German. Okay, this is not a problem then when we're setting up things like universal education, right? The schools are going to be taught in German, right? Well, in Austria is a polyglot empire. It's got Croats, it's got Slovenes, it's got Ruthenians, it's got Belarusians, it's got Austrians, it's got Bohemians. Bohemians are Czechs. On and on. So how do you set up a uniform single system of administration? A universal system of education. Because all of these people want schools in their own languages. You've got to print and make decrees in their own languages. They want administrators who are of their own nationality. It's a huge headache. It's just a huge headache. So Austria is going to attempt these things, but they're mostly going to fail and cause problems. Because schooling and language and religion, because there's Catholics, there's Muslims, there's different kinds of Protestants, there's Orthodox. It's a huge problem. And so the Austrian government decides, you know what? It's stirring everyone up. We're going to have revolts on our hands. And Austria comes out of this war determined to keep the peace. Austria is bankrupt. They've got all these militating nationalities who they're trying to keep down. So there's a reason that they are really interested in hosting this peace summit. There is a reason that a fellow by the name of Metternich, what a beautiful language. I like you. Metternich, he is very concerned with stability. No more war. No more war. He's super focused. Don't fight, guys. Now, why is that? Does he love peace? No. He is convinced that if there is another huge war, that it is going to result in the overthrow of all of the monarchies of Europe, and that there's just going to be bloody Republican revolution everywhere, destroying property and trampling on nobility. So no war, guys. No war. It's self-preservation. That's what it is. Self-preservation. And they are determined together to beat down any potential Republican uprising, of which there will be many almost right away. 1820. Spain. 1820. Italy. 1820. Greece. I'm going to talk about these next time, but I just want you to know, right away, we're 5 years in, and there's already nationalist uprisings that are going to need to be put down. And in the case of Spain, France is going to send its armies into France, not to conquer France, not to take territory from France, but to smash the Republican uprising. Italy, same thing. They're not there to take territory, they're there to beat down the revolutionaries and get things quiet again. But things are just going to keep popping up. In 1820, then 1830, then 1840, then 1848. It's just on and on and on and on, right? There's a reason that it's called the Age of Revolution, right? It's just nonstop revolution. And eventually what's going to happen here, where we're going, I only have 3 minutes. What's going to eventually happen is that a lot of these regimes are going to try to come to terms with these nationalist Republican forces. They're going to have different ways of coming to terms with them. France, we'll talk about the Third Republic. Austria really never does. The Austrian way of doing it is just to give more and more control to the local people and departments and stuff, but like, this is fatally weakening the monarchy. It's basically killing itself. Committing suicide out of fear of being killed, right? It's slowly committing suicide out of fear that if it tries something, it's going to be killed. Prussia basically takes that middle class commercial nationalism and fuses it with the old Prussian aristocracy in this kind of like really conservative nationalism, like conservative nationalism. Britain is going to eventually embrace like liberalism and universal suffrage. They'll never do it to Ireland though. Home rule for Ireland is defeated many times. And actually, there's an argument, and I actually like this argument, because I see a lot of foreign policy decisions as being functions of domestic policies. Why does Britain get involved in World War I? Well, a lot of the explanations that you hear are, well, German hegemony, France, all this other stuff. Well, right as World War I is about to break out, home rule is going to try and be imposed on Ireland. And the Ulster counties, where there's a lot of military resources, are saying, we won't do it. We won't enforce home rule. We want to stay part of the kingdom. And the army is saying, well, we're not sure about these military regiments there. They might not obey orders, and there might be a huge civil war there. And they basically say, look, we can either have home rule in Ireland, because we're going to need to use the military to enforce it. We might even need to use the military to fight the military and all these paramilitary forces. Or we can fight this war on the continent. You have to choose one or the other. And so there are arguments that the British got involved in World War I, the Conservatives got involved in World War I to keep Ireland from getting home rule. And I actually think it's a fairly compelling argument, and maybe I'll talk more about that when we get there. 1 minute. The reason this Congress system breaks down is because there are divergent interests. I mentioned this already between Britain and Russia, who emerge as easily the two most powerful. Everybody else for the next 15, 20 years is way below them. They have strong disagreements on the Eastern question. And we're going to see this come to the fore in the question of the revolution in Greece. Because the Russians don't want to put down the revolution in Greece. They're supposed to, but they don't want to. Because they see the revolution in Greece as benefiting their long-term strategic goal of taking the Straits and occupying Constantinople. So they really want to support this revolution. And so already we see this break in this united front of absolutism and monarchy against revolution. There's, what is it, on page 22 they said it? Page 17. Oh, shoot. 92. Well, oh, yeah. This idea that policy toward each revolutionary movement would increasingly be determined not by their political system, but by their attitude and situation. In short, the determination was no longer ideological, it was reason of state. That's like what we call national interest today. So it means, I don't care that these are a bunch of crazy Republican insurgents and that they hate czarism and autocracy. It would benefit the state interest of Russia to see the Ottomans weakened here. So we're going to support these insurgents. So there you go. I'll see you all on Monday. I'm going to post something on Friday. And there will be a discussion board as well, but I'm going to post more stuff about this on Friday. Have a wonderful rest of the week. The quiz has been up. I haven't looked to see if it is visible, though. I did remember to make it visible. So the quiz is due tonight, so don't forget about that. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Usually against if I I'm really struggling with writing looking for like small margins. The way.
Yeah.
Is it usually against me like turning the paper in early?
No, not at all. You can write as much fitness you want immediately.
Okay.
I just do that because a lot of people have the opposite problem.
Yeah,
Well,
I really
yeah.
struggle like.
No problem.
Okay.
No problem. I did that because I thought that it would benefit